What you are about to hear is not just a war story. It is a story about power, about money, about how a country most of the world underestimated has figured out something that billion-dollar defense contractors and Ivy League strategists never did, that the fastest way to end a war is not always on the front line. Sometimes it is deep inside the enemy's industrial heartland in the dead of night with a drone that costs less than a used pickup truck. And what happened in Cherepovets, Russia, Narsu, all those eyes a see these I rise not once but twice in the span of a single month, whereas as in see San or Wansu is one of the most consequential economic strikes of this entire war. Ukraine did not just hit a factory. Ukraine confirmed a drone strike on Russia's Apatit chemical plant in Cherepovets, a key producer linked to explosives, marking the second hit on the facility in a single month. And the numbers surrounding this facility, the geopolitical weight it carries, the supply chains it feeds, and the ammunition it helps manufacture, all of it adds up to something that should be front page news in every newspaper in America. So let's talk about what really happened, why it matters to you sitting in the United States right now, and what it tells us about the direction this war is heading. Let us start with the plant itself, because the mainstream media loves to gloss over the details, and the details here are everything. The Apatit facility accounts for roughly 6% of Russia's total ammonia production and is also a major European producer of phosphate-based fertilizers and industrial acids, including phosphoric and sulfuric acid, ammonium nitrate, and NPK fertilizers. Now read that again slowly. This is not some regional chemical depot sitting on the outskirts of a forgotten town. Joint stock company Apatit is the largest producer of phosphorus-containing fertilizers, phosphoric and sulfuric acids in Europe, as well as one of the leaders in Russia in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer production. Europe's largest, not Russia's largest, Europe's largest. That is the scale of what Ukraine reached out and touched from over 800 kilometers away, flying drones through one of the most heavily monitored airspaces on the planet. And here is where it gets truly interesting, because what makes this story so important is that the Apatit plant is not just feeding Russia's agricultural sector, it is feeding Russia's war machine. This chemical giant produces hundreds of thousands of tons of ammonia, nitrate, and nitric acid annually, and its output serves as raw material for the production of TNT, RDX, and other components used in ammunition manufacturing. So when you see those numbers, the $23.5 billion valuation attached to the broader Fosagro group, of which Apatit is the crown jewel, understand that you are not looking at a fertilizer company in any simple sense of the word. You are looking at the backbone of Russia's ability to sustain its ammunition supply chain. Every shell that lands on a Ukrainian city, every artillery round that grinds down Ukrainian positions, traces a supply chain that runs directly through facilities like this one. Ukraine did not hit a chemical plant. Ukraine hit Russia's war machine at one of its most critical nodes. Now, let us talk about how they actually did it, because the operational genius here deserves serious recognition. Cherepovets is located in Russia's Vologda Oblast, around 500 kilometers northeast of Moscow, actually used by, and actually more than 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Think about what that means for a moment. Ukraine flew attack drones over 800 kilometers of enemy-monitored territory, evaded one of the most layered air defense networks in the world, and struck with enough precision to set fires inside a highly secure industrial complex. According to OSINT analysts Cyber Baroshno, black smoke was observed at 2 of the plant's 3 ammonia units, which have a combined annual capacity of 900,000 tons. 2 out of 3 ammonia units hit. That is not a near miss. That is a surgical strike on industrial infrastructure conducted with what are essentially consumer-grade drone components assembled in Ukrainian workshops and garages. The asymmetry of that reality should make every military strategist on Earth stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. So is saying a Robert Eni Maizais Raizans Robert Madyar Brovdi, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, confirmed the strike on the Russian chemical plant Apatit in Cherepovets, describing the plant as a giant chemical producer that produces hundreds of thousands of tons of ammonia, nitrate, and nitric acid per year, using the term worm to echo the signature nickname by which he calls enemy human drone targets. There is something deeply symbolic in that language. So, because they and were, Brovdi is not speaking the language of conventional military commanders. So Owais. He is speaking the language of a new kind of warfare. one that is precise, relentless, and almost darkly poetic in how it reframes the enemy's industrial infrastructure as just another target to be exterminated. He is treating a $23 billion industrial complex the same way his units treat an enemy soldier on the front line, and that matters because it tells you something profound about how Ukraine has fundamentally restructured its strategic thinking. There were also reports of a possible strike on ammonia storage facilities, which had been reinforced with protective metal structures after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Read that detail carefully. Russia knew this facility was a target. They reinforced the ammonia storage. They put metal structures around it. They prepared, and Ukraine hit it anyway. That tells you something very specific about the trajectory of this conflict that no press conference in Washington or Brussels is going to tell you plainly. Ukraine is winning the technological and strategic adaptation race. Russia protects, Ukraine innovates, Russia reinforces, Ukraine finds another angle, and the deeper this dynamic runs, the more it exposes the fundamental weakness at the core of Russia's war economy, which is that you cannot defend everything everywhere all at once when your enemy is willing to fly drones 800 kilometers to hit what you thought was untouchable. Let us also talk about the broader context of this strike, because Cherepovets is not an isolated incident. It is the latest in a series of deep strike operations that are systematically dismantling Russia's economic and industrial warfighting capacity. Ukraine's strikes on oil refining facilities deep inside Russia have dealt a major blow to Moscow's economy, and Zelensky has said that the Russians have lost more than 20% of their oil refining capacity and about 22 to 27% of their fuel. Think about that number for a moment. 20% of oil refining capacity gone. Oil is the lifeblood of Russia's entire economic model. It is what funds the military, what keeps the state apparatus running, what allows Putin to write the checks that keep his oligarchs loyal and his generals in line. Every percentage point of that capacity that Ukraine takes offline is a percentage point less cash flowing into the Kremlin's war machine. And now layer on top of that the damage to Cherepovets, to the ammonia supply chain, to the explosives manufacturing capacity, and you start to see a picture that the headline numbers alone don't capture. In total, attacks on ports in Primorsk and Ust-Luga may have affected up to 40% of Russia's seaborne oil exports, around 2 million barrels per day, dealing a significant blow to a key source of Kremlin revenue. 40% of seaborne oil exports. Port terminals on fire. Ammonia units disabled. Oil refining capacity down by a fifth. These are not the statistics of a war that Russia is winning. These are the statistics of an economy that is being methodically bled from the inside out, not by NATO divisions or American cruise missiles, but by Ukrainian drone operators running operations on shoestring budgets compared to what Russia spends per day just keeping its front lines supplied. And here is what really needs to be said clearly to an American audience, because I think there is a failure of imagination happening in this country around what this war actually means for the United States. People ask why why should I care about a chemical plant in Cherepovets? Why should I care about a city most Americans can't find on a map? Here is why. The global fertilizer market is one of the most geopolitically sensitive commodity markets on Earth. Russia and its proxies control enormous portions of global fertilizer production. Fosagro and Brister, the parent company of the Apatit plant in is not just a Russian domestic supplier. Fosagro generates revenue throughout the world, with Russia and Europe being its biggest markets, and it controls its logistics operations through the ownership of ships, ports, and railroad cars. This company feeds global agriculture. Its products end up in the food supply chains of dozens of nations. When Ukraine strikes this facility, it is not just disrupting Russia's ammunition supply chain, it is sending a message to every government on Earth that buys Russian fertilizers, that signs contracts with Russian chemical companies, that thinks it can maintain normal commercial relations with Moscow while Moscow wages a war of annihilation against its neighbor. That message is nothing in Russia is safe from the consequences of this war. Not your supply chain, not your contracts, not your strategic dependencies. That is an extraordinary geopolitical statement, and it is one that is going almost entirely unremarked upon in the mainstream American media conversation about this conflict. We get endless coverage of frontline positions, of territorial gains and losses measured in kilometers, of diplomatic summits that produce statements but not solutions. What we do not get nearly enough of is this kind of clear-eyed analysis of what Ukraine is actually doing to Russia's long-term warfighting capacity and what it means for the global balance of power. because this is where the real story of this war is being written, not in on not in the muddy trenches of Donetsk, but in the burning ammonia units of Cherepovets, in the flaming oil terminals on the Baltic coast, in the cascading disruptions to a Russian economy that was always more brittle than its propaganda suggested. 5 people were injured with acid burns in the attack, one seriously after a high-pressure pipeline was burst. That is the human reality of what happened inside that plant. A high-pressure acid pipeline rupturing, fire spreading through industrial units that process some of the most dangerous chemicals in industrial chemistry. This is not clean and it is not bloodless, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. So war never is. But here is the question that a serious analyst has to ask: what is the alternative? The alternative is that this plant continues producing the nitric acid, the ammonium nitrate, the chemical precursors that flow directly into the shells, raining down on Ukrainian civilians every single day. The alternative is that Russia's ammunition manufacturing capacity remains intact while Ukrainian cities burn. When you frame it that way, and you should, because it is accurate, the moral calculus of these strikes looks very different than the reflexive horror that follows any image of industrial destruction. The Ukrainian monitoring channel Exylanova Pol wrote that attack drones flew over 1,000 kilometers while jamming the internet, blocking social media, and driving Russians into the FSB's control through the Max Messenger, and hit one of the largest chemical plants in Europe. There is an entire information warfare dimension to this operation that deserves its own analysis. Ukraine is not just striking physical targets, it is demonstrating capability. Every successful deep strike is a psychological operation conducted not just against the Russian military, but against the Russian population, against Russian investors, against the international business community that still has exposure to Russian assets. The message being sent is layered and deliberate. Ukraine Ukraine can reach anywhere, anytime, and no amount of Russian air defense spending is enough to make the country's industrial heartland safe as long as this war continues. And what does Moscow do in response? Regional Governor Georgy Filimonov said 13 drones targeted the city's industrial zone and that emergency services were working at sites. The governor confirms the attack, claims drones were shot down, denies significant damage. It is the same playbook Russia has used every single time Ukraine lands a significant strike inside Russian territory. Minimize, deflect, claim air defense was effective, and then the satellite imagery comes out, the OSINT analysts publish their assessments, the smoke plumes are photographed by civilians on their phones and uploaded to Telegram, and the truth leaks through regardless of what the governor says on state television. Russia's information management around these strikes is failing because the strikes are simply too visible, too impactful, and too well documented by an open source intelligence community that has become one of the most sophisticated in the world over the course of this conflict. What Ukraine has built over the past 3 years is something genuinely new in the history of warfare. It is a drone industrial complex that is decentralized, adaptable, and producing at scale in ways that confound the traditional military procurement model. According to Zelensky, 90 to 95% of deep strike operations inside Russia now use Ukrainian-made systems, with only a few launched using British Storm Shadow or French Scalp missiles. 90 to 95% domestic production. Ukraine is not waiting for the West to supply it with the weapons it needs to reach inside Russia. It is building them. It is engineering them in conditions of active war. It is testing them in real combat and refining them based on operational feedback in a way that no peacetime defense contractor can replicate. That is a profound transformation of Ukrainian military industrial capacity that most American analysts are still not fully grappling with. There is a bigger picture here that I want you to sit with because it has implications that extend far beyond this war. What Ukraine is demonstrating is that the strategic geography of modern conflict has fundamentally shifted. Distance used to be a form of protection. If your industry was 800 kilometers from the front line, you were safe. Your factories could hum, your supply chains could flow, your workers could report to shifts without looking over their shoulders. That assumption is now dead. Ukraine has killed it, and every government in the world with strategic dependencies on industrial infrastructure in conflict-adjacent regions needs to be revising its threat models accordingly. The world after this war is going to be a fundamentally different place in terms of how nations think about the vulnerability of their economic infrastructure to precision long-range strikes conducted by actors with far more modest resources than traditional superpowers. Ukraine regularly reportedly strikes military infrastructure deep inside Russia and the occupied territories in an effort to diminish Moscow's capacity to continue waging war on Ukraine, and Kyiv considers energy facilities to be valid military targets as the energy sites provide fuel and funding for the Kremlin's war machine. That is a strategic doctrine, clearly articulated, consistently executed. It is the doctrine of economic warfare conducted through precision strikes on the nodes that sustain an adversary's capacity to fight. So this and it is working. Not in the sense that Russia is about to collapse tomorrow. Let us be clear-eyed about that. Russia's economy has shown remarkable resilience to sanctions and strikes alike, partly through adaptation and partly through the enormous fiscal buffers accumulated during years of high oil prices. But resilience is not the same as invulnerability, and the cumulative effect of losing 20% of refining capacity, of having your most important chemical complex struck twice in a month, of watching your port infrastructure burned from the inside, that cumulative effect compounds over time in ways that will matter enormously to the long-term trajectory of this war. The story of Cherepovets is the story of a small nation that refused to accept the terms of its own destruction. It is the story of engineers and commanders and drone operators who looked at a problem. How do you fight a nuclear-armed adversary with a GDP many times your size, and found an answer that nobody in the established military-industrial complex had thought to look for. They found it in the combination of cheap, scalable unmanned systems, sophisticated electronic warfare, open-source intelligence, and an absolute clarity of strategic purpose that cuts through the noise of diplomatic equivocation and gets straight to the economic jugular of the enemy. What happened in Cherepovets on April 13, 2026 will be studied in military academies for a generation. Not because of the damage it caused in isolation, but because of what it represents. The ongoing dismantling of a $23 billion industrial pillar of Russia's war economy, one drone strike at a time, by a country that the world once counted out and has since refused to die.